Thank you very much. Wilson Boniolo.
Thanks. That was a rich and very interesting talk. So my question is a very slight tangent, but I hope you'll forgive me. So that a deep question that you raised was the relationship between sort of wellness, illness, and happiness, and that quite a lot of the empirical research suggests some interesting things about people who have disabilities and people who have long-term illnesses. That very often you'd expect that, for instance, being blind or deaf, if you didn't know anything about it, that might mean it would have a really bad effect on your quality of life, or that similarly if you had something like sort of COPD, that would be catastrophic for your happiness. But very often people who have disabilities or they have long-term, or if they have long-term illnesses, it turns out it seems to have less effect on their happiness than you might expect. And I was just wondering how that observation relates to the thoughts about the importance of wellness. Is that exactly the same point you're making, or is it?
You hit the point, and we spoke gender before. I mean, I have patients, women that had 7, 8 children, and I am sure some of these women shouldn't have had these children had they listened to optimization of certain view of wellness. And they have many chronic illnesses, some directly related to childbearing, but they are considered themselves well and happy. Now, I'm not here to judge, and this is not a question for IT technologies to decide what is wellness on the lifespan for these women, for example. And the women, the gender issue is especially important because you can see less the female life in an atomistic way. There's a reproductive cycle. It does not define being a woman, but it's important here. And it's also true for many fathers and many people that take vocations that are not the best for their whatever wellness. It's exactly the point, that we must keep control over wellness from understanding and from our human values, yes.
Say one more thing, if that's...
She's the chair, I never argue with her.
There's an important distinction that Daniel Kahneman, the psychologist, makes between two different ways of thinking about well-being. He distinguishes between episodic well-being and narrative well-being, so that he did a very famous experiment asking parents to basically to look at their lives. And so when a buzzer went off and people asked, what are you doing at this moment? Are you happy or not? How much you're enjoying yourself? Then typically the mothers said that they weren't particularly enjoying the time they spent with their children. But if you ask people at a bigger level, what makes your life most worthwhile, then people will say that it is the having the children that is, so that there may be just different perspectives from which we can think about our wellness and our happiness, and maybe that something that we need to think through is thinking more broadly about personalized medicine.
I thank you for mentioning, because I'm driving beyond this. I don't care much, it's important, for feeling well or enjoyment or satisfaction. It's not psychology, but letting people reach their fulfillment as humans. This is a human calling, and it hopefully correlates well with feeling well. And this way questionnaire this time, but it does not define it, and is not a condition. And one of my worries that if we put too much emphasis and numbers on and less definite what wellness is, we might forget the other dimension. Wellness is instrumental. And sometimes we might need even less or different wellness for the goals we choose as humans.
Thanks, Michael. I am rather sympathetic with what you said, but let me do the philosopher of science. At the end, I could be what it is supposed that I am. When you speak about black box, actually think about the big data that we have. How to manage the big data? One of the possibilities to manage big data is by using cluster theory. That is, what do you put inside the algorithm? You put inside what you choose. You put inside genomic data, genomic and transcriptomic data, just genomic and epigenomic data, omic data and nothing else, omic data and clinical data, whatever you want. So nothing is blinded. Everything is dependent on the choice of the scientist. So you put inside and you use the cluster theory. Is a cluster theory a black box? No, because anyone who knows how to manage cluster theory knows exactly what is going on. So there are several ways of applying cluster theory because there are several algorithms. Is a black box? No, because it is dependent on the choice of the scientist. So when you have chosen the algorithm, you decide the distance, because the main characterization feature of a cluster theory approach is to work, instead of working by means of feature carried by the single individual, you work in terms of similarity to a patient zero. Who chose the patient zero? Is a black box? No, because it is dependent on the choice of the scientist. There are many ways of describing the distance. Who decides the distance?
I will.
So there is no black box at all.
I be brief. Black box is relative.
Is?
I read some of the scientists' papers, it's black box for me. The point is in the participation and integration. It has to do with this photo shown, I think, Barbara, of the country doctor by Berg. Because if the information technology people and the patient and the male nurse assistant share a same network of solidarity, the chances of misusing or not paying attention to data is lower. This is the point. But when we have less social integration and there is an allied group programming, there is another group with a stake, with a stocks far away in New York City. There are patients in Pakistan or in rural Israel. Then problems start to arise. No, because we need to have a shared society. And this helps also the information. I'm not telling citizens to decide for the IT person. But once the IT person and the head of the lab is integrated in society at the value level, and also the socio-economic gap is not too big, I think is the best way to help program properly.
Yes, but there is no black box at all. That is, anyone who is working with big data knows exactly what is going on. And he knows or she knows that any choice is made by a scientist. So it is, every choice is theory-laden or value-laden. And you can make the values explicit without any problem.
No, not necessarily. Sometimes research is empirically done. You have huge database, and you tell people write codes, either correlation between A and B, C and D. So here theory is very, very thin. And if you find that the use of certain drug for cholesterol happens to cure your throat cancer, you will go after it in a clinical trial. And a part of the spirit in this way, the theory could be seen and thick. You don't let monkeys just program.
No, but there are no monkeys. It is, everything is clear, it's transparent. That is, bioinformatics is not something magic. It's something that...
If everybody shares the algorithm or the code, it's not open code to start with. That she mentioned. Assuming you are right, if everybody shares the code.
I wish to let words to two more people, Professor Hood and Professor Prinsak. Please, short.
Yes, I'd like to reinforce the fact that when we make a presentation from this workshop, we should accurately describe what personalized medicine is. And I totally agree with the preceding comment. There is not a black box in personalized medicine in the sense that for the wellness we're doing, the integration of the data point successively to one of hundreds of papers in the literature that are approved with evidence-based medicine that suggest what you should do. We are going to get to a point with really complex diseases like Alzheimer's. But again, I think this consilience program has the ability to show the logic all the way through to any physician or not. I think really what you're talking about is an enormous challenge that we haven't even discussed here, and that is, how do you educate patients about how to think about these kind of things? I think it's unfair just to go up to patients and say, look, I want you to fill out these 20 pages, give me your impressions. And depending on their school, depending on their background, depending on their social status and so forth, the answers will be very different. I think it's critical to think about this question of education, which to a first approximation hasn't been mentioned at all in this meeting.
So our colleague Richard Tutton, when he wrote his book about personalized medicine, which was very much genomic medicine actually in his iteration, but he said the one characterizing feature is the end of the standard, the end of the idea, the end of the fiction of a standard patient. But that also applies to wellness. So I think what you are missing in your analysis is that the idea of wellness also becomes sort of personalized. And I'm not only talking vision here, but I'm also talking metrics and methodologies to do that. So patient-centered experience measures and patient-centered outcome measures, which, as you know, obtain a much, much more important role in drug approvals, in anything, in quality measurements, in value measurements. These are instruments that move the assessment of value, of aims and outcomes closer to the person. So I don't mean to be overly optimistic and say this solves the problem, but I think if we tell the story of sort of a move from disease to wellness and to data-driven practice, I think that is part of the story as well. And in some ways it makes it easier, because the example of the woman with 7 or 8 children could actually be helped with such a model that brings in a systematic way in what she wants, but it also makes the situation more complex, because it still means we are sort of we're using a techno-scientific model to capture even well-being. So it complicates the story even further, I think.
Thank you very much.